you've done a couple of really insightful pieces about some of the figures who were key players in the decision to launch what was called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th, 2023. And I want to begin by asking you to describe who Yahya Sinwar actually was. You start with where he was born, what his upbringing was like. Sinwar, for people that may not be familiar, at the time that he was killed in battle by the Israelis, not hiding in a tunnel, autopsy showed that he hadn't eaten almost anything for 3 days. He was not living off of stolen aid, as was said about him. Totally cartoonish portrayal of him. Regardless of what anyone thinks about the facts of it, we should understand who Yahya Sinwar was, because in many ways, his story is the story of armed resistance in Gaza. So as someone who has really studied his life, Mohammed, maybe start from the beginning and walk us through who Sinwar was.
So Yahya Sinwar was born in the 1960s in the Khan Yunis refugee camp. Quite a few of the leaders of Hamas, and especially the Qassam brigades, were born in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in the 1960s. Hamad Daif was also, I think he and Sinwar were neighbors or lived near each other, grew up near each other. Sinwar was a dynamic and strong-willed personality, often kind of cartoonishly referred to as a hardliner, but Sinwar was one of the first members of the initial Hamas military wing in the late 1980s. So the group was formed in late December 1987. They had what they called an internal security force, where they were tasked with kind of weeding out collaborators in Gaza at the time. Now, at the time, collaborators were actually pretty easy to find, and they were well known because they were Palestinians who were given arms by the Israelis. And because there was no military presence for any kind of Palestinian resistance, they could move and walk around freely. Sinwar was tasked with rooting out some of these collaborators, and when the Israelis caught him, I think in 89 or 88, he was accused of killing several Palestinian collaborators and sentenced to several life sentences in Israeli jails. He spent more than 20 years in jail and was released in the prisoner swap in 2011. But during his time in jail, he was kind of out of sight, out of mind. He wasn't really a well-known figure to the Palestinian public, but he was a big leader in the prisoner movement inside Israeli jail. So for Hamas, their leadership is kind of divided between what they call the internal leadership, that's in Gaza and the West Bank, the external leadership, that's leadership that lives abroad, and then the prisoner leadership. And they all have a say in the group's strategic thinking and strategic planning. Sinwar was very senior in the prisoner movement, and he helped negotiate the deal that saw him freed. So when Hamas captured an Israeli soldier out of a tank on the Israeli border with Gaza in 2006, the negotiations were done under German mediation. They took about 5 years, very, very, very difficult negotiations. And at one point, as the negotiators, believed that they'd come to an agreement and a deal, they decided on who would be released in exchange for this captured Israeli soldier. The list was sent to Yahya Sinwar in Israeli prison. And Sinwar took a look at it. His name was top of the list. And he noticed that all the Palestinian prisoners to be released were from Gaza and the West Bank. And for him, that was a problem because he noticed that there were no Palestinians from Jerusalem that were on the list. And this was a very important symbol for him because the Israelis have annexed Jerusalem, considered part of their capital. And the Palestinians in Jerusalem are not allowed to participate in any kind of political life, Palestinian political life. And so for Sinwar, he felt that not having any prisoners released from Jerusalem would be an abandonment of, a symbolic abandonment of the city that the Palestinians want to claim as their capital. So he refused to sign off on the list, knowing that the Israeli authorities would punish him. And he was immediately sent into solitary for several months. But at the end, the deal was signed and Sinwar got his way. the list of prisoners freed. I think it was 1,024 prisoners. Sinwar was on top of that list, but it also included many people from Jerusalem as well. So that's the kind of man that he was, very strong-willed, even while kind of in Israeli prison, even while he was subject to the whims of Israeli prison wardens. He was the kind of man that just would not give in on things that he saw as key principles, even when the balance of power was very much against him.
And while he was in prison, he wrote a couple of books, both fiction and nonfiction. But he also became a student of the Hebrew language and of Israeli history and of Jewish history. And one of the projects that he undertook, and he also took a number of online courses or correspondence courses while he was in prison. But among the projects that he undertook was to, by hand, translate from Hebrew into Arabic memoirs of the former heads of Shin Bet. And what's clear is that he treated prison also as a classroom of sorts to study the enemy. And by the time he was freed under this deal that he played a major role in negotiating, where the Hamas returned Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, he had completed what was essentially a PhD in the study of Israel's security state, its culture, its mentality toward the Palestinian. And there's all kinds of stories from guys that were in prison with him about hand delivering some of these manuscripts around, so that and Sinwar encouraging people to read the memoirs of the Shin Bet, the former heads of the Shin Bet. In fact, some of his Israelis, you have to be careful with Israeli sourcing on this, because there's also a lot of fantastical, almost certainly false stories that have been promoted about things Sinwar has said, or that his nickname was the Butcher of Khan Yunis, which seems to be entirely an Israeli and Western media invention. But you do have stories that I think ring quite true in terms of Sinwar telling people who were his interrogators or others being in touch with him that one day he was going to come back in a spectacular way, and they were going to be on the other side of it. But he then is released from prison. He returns to Gaza, and eventually he ascends to the political leadership of Hamas. So take it sort of from that period as he comes back out of prison, returns to Gaza, and then becomes a very, very public figure.
So I think one thing I caution people is to not assume that Yahya Sinwar came out of prison with this idea of carrying out Operation Al-Aqsa Flood kind of formed in his mind, ready to go. His life as a public figure in Gaza and then as a leader of Hamas in Gaza indicates something actually slightly different. When he went to prison, Hamas was just a small group of, you could count the number of members of Hamas on a couple of hands, right? Just a few dozen people. He came out and he saw basically the Qassam brigades had become a mini army. He saw that the movement had become a government, and that he saw that it had a presence all over the Palestinian territories, as well as in several Arab countries as well. So it was a very different world that he came out of jail into. But also, as he became the leader of Hamas in Gaza, he had to confront the fact that the people in Gaza were suffering, had been suffering for decades under this crippling closure and then siege. And I think it's very instructive to read the two interviews that he gave to foreign journalists. In 2018, he spoke to an Italian journalist for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. And the interview was then translated into Hebrew and English by multiple Israeli newspapers. And in it, and this was in the context of the Great March of Return, which, if you remember, Jeremy, 2018, for an entire year, every week, tens of thousands of Palestinians would march unarmed peacefully to the boundary with Israel, calling for an end to the siege and a return to their homes. So a completely civil, peaceful march. And Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, took part in that every single week and encouraged it and stood by kind of the decision to protest in this unarmed fashion, even though, like I said, they had a mini army in Gaza. And during that interview, Sinwar spoke of the need to lift the siege on Gaza, and he spoke, and these are his words. He spoke about his heartbreak at seeing young people in Gaza, especially when they go to the sea, which is kind of Gaza's only kind of frontier that isn't with Israel, and just staring across the ocean because they have no prospects, no future, no ability to leave, no freedom of travel. And he said it broke his heart. And for him, the solution was that Israel should end the siege on Gaza in exchange for a long-term truce, which he described as a generational truce, not 1 year, not 2, not 5 years, so that the current generation of Palestinians and Israelis that were growing up would have a chance at some point in the future to come to a deal under better terms than what he and his generation had been forced to live under. So that's not the image that you tend to get of Yahya Sinwar, but this is what he spoke about to foreign media and in interviews that were then published in the Israeli newspapers. So in exchange for just ending the siege, he offered a long-term generational truce and the hope that Israeli children and Palestinian children could come to an agreement that would end this conflict once and for all. So
and one also just historical note that I think I always bring this up when we talk about the Great March of Return protests that you were just describing in 2018, that Sinwar and other Hamas officials endorsed, because it pushes back against the dominant narrative. But Palestinians go in the thousands and thousands to these protests, and Israeli snipers hold the competition who can kneecap or
yep.
or permanently disable the
Yep.
largest number of unarmed Palestinian protesters during that period. So when people say, well, why didn't they protest nonviolently? Not only did they protest nonviolently, but Yahya Sinwar endorsed those protests, including to international media organizations.
Correct. And the world response to kind of this year-long peaceful protest was just complete. The world just shrugged. There was no pressure put on Israel to even ease the siege. Like I said, this wasn't a protest to create a kind of a final resolution to the conflict, just an end to this crippling siege that had de-developed Gaza and destroyed the lives of all its people. And I think for Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, that was instructive and transformational, because to them, they'd given, the way they saw it, is they'd given this route a chance. This was something that also, I mean, just to bring it back to someone like Mahmoud Abbas, this was the thing that he'd been endorsing. He said, if you want to resist, then we resist peacefully. We do unarmed resistance. We don't do armed resistance because of the power imbalance. So Hamas leaders in Gaza say, well, we tried that. And what we got was hundreds of people killed, tens of thousands of people wounded, and the world just would not engage with any of our proposals, even for a long-term truce. So in that, you see kind of the seeds for Operation Al-Aqsa Flood being planted there amongst Hamas's leaders.